All right, Josh, thanks for taking the time again to chat about solar financing. And I wanted to really dig into solar leases, the third-party ownership model today, because it's trending up. It's tied to the domestic content adder, which is getting everyone interested. And, not everyone out there is offering it or has it in the past, and now maybe needs to kind of get up to speed, right? Let's start at the very basics here first. As an installer, why should I consider offering solar systems via leases, aka third-party ownership?
If you're an installer contemplating whether you should use TPO or not, do it. And I'm not saying that as like you need to have it. I suggest it as it's another tool for your tool belt. It's going to allow you to approach a market, your neighborhood, and say, hey, I now have access to maybe 2 out of 10, 3 out of 10 more homeowners because they didn't want to take on debt. They didn't want to do a loan. They didn't want to put money down. Or perhaps they're trying to save money on a monthly basis and they're more payment constrained versus their utility bill, where TPO is gonna beat a loan all day, even with rates having dropped recently. Depending on how reflexive lenders can be, let's assume they eventually lowered because Jerome Powell and the Fed lowered rates by 50 bips. You're still probably going to have a lower payment from TPO. So you're going to be able to address customers who you might not have won before and say, hey, I can get you a lower payment than your utility bill by X amount more by using this product. So I think that's really attractive for you, and also gives you another, steady revenue stream for folks who are in that category for areas where that's going to be more of a concern.
Kind of makes perfect sense, but there's obviously, it's a bit more complicated than just, hey, I'm going to offer you this lower rate and then that's it, right? So, okay, so what questions do I need to ask about my business, or I guess maybe my customer base, to help me better understand the financial strategies I should pursue here?
Yeah, that's important, right? Because it is more complicated than just lower payment, right? Because ultimately the tax credit plays a big role in that. We can even take domestic content piece aside and just talk about the 30%. Can someone monetize that? If not, that's an easy TPO, right? Because that 30% chunk for a loan, when you re-amortize the loan, is going to keep someone's payment that's, the same after that 18-month period when they have to roll the loan back in. And if you don't know what I'm talking about right now, please talk to me. Happy to help walk through the differences in detail about how loans and TPO work. But generally speaking, you need to be asking homeowners, or even if you're going commercial, how do you monetize the tax credit? Can you monetize the tax credit? If not, let's lean more into a TPO product where then the TPO provider does that for you, essentially. Since they're the ones that own the system, they get the tax credit benefits and pass that off onto the homeowner. Typically, we'll expand on that in a little bit. But I think if you're equipped business-wise to educate customers on the long-term benefits of TPO versus traditional sales, then you're set up. If you're not, and you're already struggling to sell finance, it's going to be hard to sell a different kind of finance, right? So make sure your sales team understands how these are structured, how the benefits align for a homeowner, and how also they might not work for a homeowner. Because the last thing you want to do for your long-term viability as a company to be putting folks in bad finance structures that don't actually make sense for them. You're asking for bad reviews. You're asking for not getting referrals, right? So educate yourself. Make sure your sales team understands that this is more than just, a payment. It is thinking about the entire financial viability of a homeowner while also not giving tax advice. So you're in a really tough position as an installer. Believe me, I've been there, where you're trying to manage all these expectations and things with homeowners. But really, if you do what's the right thing, if you do what's right, you'll come out on top.
Still thinking further about like the solar, the operation side of things. What are the fundamental differences with the third-party ownership model that I need to be ready for to actually execute on this in the moment and then in the long term?
The O&M piece, I think, plays a big role in the true difference between TPO and cash or financing. Let's step back and look at, you're an installer in business today. Are you getting calls from orphaned homeowners who don't have a solar installer anymore because that company went out of business, and you're getting calls to fix their equipment? I mean, homeowners frustrated, you're busy, but you could capitalize on that, right? And perhaps monetize it. That's a whole different vertical of your business that could be helpful. Why does that play into TPO and O&M? Well, you might already have O&M set up inside your company, which is great. If not, you want to make sure the structure that you're getting from the TPO provider is somehow you're being compensated for that O&M, right? So you're able to go back to your homeowners and say, yep, you're right. this panel, this optimizer, this micro, whatever, isn't working anymore. TPO provider noticed it because they're the ones perhaps tracking it. Another question you'll want to ask. And how do I get compensated for fixing it? Because ultimately, your job is to keep putting glass on a roof. So thinking about those things, thinking about TPO providers and how they structure their O&M is a huge fundamental difference between cash and finance, because that is on you. Ultimately, the homeowner bought and paid for the system, likely without a service package from you. And if they did, great, perfect. You already set yourself up. But if not, it's still your responsibility. Whereas on the TPO side, that's baked in. So ask those questions of your TPO providers.
At the front end, is there more work to do as well, like to get the deal signed or approved by the TPO provider? Like, what's that process like?
Important question. Really important, because yes, you're going to be tasked with doing a lot more steps. I want to say a lot more. I don't want to scare anybody off, but like, it's a necessary thing to do, right? Because if you're the owner of the system, whether that be a homeowner or the TPO provider, you want to make sure this thing works. The TPO provider is going to be in a relationship with this customer, this homeowner, for 20 plus years. They want to make sure you installed this to spec, and it's going to live through that lifeline. So yeah, you'll be doing mostly it comes down to more pictures. You'll be taking more pictures post install to submit to your provider to say, hey, yes, there's no drooping wires touching the roof. Yes, everything's aligned. Micros are tightened to spec. Yes, this is the exact SKU of the product I promised that I would install, which is also going to be important for domestic content purposes, right? And that 10% adder, they want to make sure it is domestic content and can vouch that it is because the SKU matches. So yeah, you're going to have more steps. But if you want to make more money, if you want to serve more customers, you're going to have to do some things that are a little harder than the normal way of doing it.
And I think that could be partially a good thing for the solar industry, which battles a little bit with, quality and trustworthiness issues for different companies. So just having another check and balance, I think can be a good thing, possibly. When evaluating TPO providers, how do I do that? I guess, what are the fine print things I should be paying attention to?
Every TPO provider is going to have a different strategy in how they monetize the tax credit for domestic content, and if that gets passed on to the homeowner. So without saying names, there's different strategies out. I'll name the two spectrums because there's definitely a spectrum. You have the one end, folks saying you aren't going to be able to take anything with a tax credit. It's for us, the TPO provider. Just sell it, and it is what it is. But we're often using an ability to still sell something that's American made, which is great, right? It's going to get a lot of people interested. Let's swing over to the other spectrum where we have TPO providers who are going to be able to pass that savings onto you, the contractor, whether that be for you to keep yourself and increase your margin, or pass off onto the homeowner to save more money, which who doesn't want happy customers, right? Because if you're competing with someone offering a different TPO, whether it be this one or another one, you want to be able to compete on something. And unfortunately or fortunately, price is obviously a major factor in your sales as an installer. So having that flexibility from a TPO provider is important. So when you're evaluating them, ask them, how is this going to be monetized? Who's getting the tax credit? How am I able to use that in my sales pitch? Understand from the lease provider, PPA provider, how they monitor systems, how production is guaranteed, because that's not only going to help you on the back end under the side, decide operationally where to allocate some resources, but also from a sales side, how are your salespeople going to pitch O&M? So I think that kind of changes your strategy a little bit on the front end of a deal. Is, do we talk about this? Do we highlight this? Do we present expectations for a homeowner if it's maybe not an ideal situation? How do you get out ahead of it? That way, at least you've talked about it and can capture that 5-star review and feel good about it, because they're not going to change it later because you said, hey, if X happens, we need to do Y. You could get into some of the compliance and experience stuff. So like, how are you really making sure that you're compliant? Because ultimately, if the TPO provider is, monetizing the tax credit at all, whether for the homeowner or for themselves, they need to make sure they're actually install, or you're actually installing TPO, domestic content equipment, right? So are they compliant? How are they staying compliant? Because if they're not staying compliant, well, they might not be around very long to help you do more business. So you got to check out the compliance and the financial viability of the company to see if they're still going to be around for a while. And most are. I feel like obviously SunPower, that happened recently. That's very recent memory sort of a thing. We have a good amount of TPO providers today that I feel good about. But ultimately for you, you need to have a backup plan, right? You need to have not only the loan provider and TPO provider, but maybe have one that does both, have a second one that you also have just in case. Diversification is key. So in that same vein, make sure to ask like, hey, are you looking for a certain amount of volume per month? Like, will you turn me off if I'm not giving you 5 deals a month? If I'm using you for a second look, like how mad are you going to be at me? Is that going to turn me off? So these are all questions that I can help you ask your TPO providers or lenders, and just to prep you for that conversation. I'm not going to sit in every conversation you have with those folks, but I want to train you guys to understand that these are questions you should ask to think about your business and your customers.
On the financial side of things, is this possibly then better overall for my cash flow, or like what does that side look like?
Payment milestones they're about the same. So if you're looking at how you get paid from a loan at M2 or beyond, it's going to be about the same on a TPO project. So I don't think there's going to be a clear difference there for your cash flow. It depends on what you're going to do on the O&M side and factor in costs in the future of going out, making said truck roll and replacing equipment, right? So and who knows, you might be compensating for it up on the front side because that was factored in, maybe not. So important question to ask your TPO provider, because they all have different strategies like they do with domestic content. If you have a provider who offers split pay through your distributor, that's obviously going to improve your cash flow because you're getting your biggest bill paid right then and there. And from any money you're receiving from the provider, you're immediately able to apply that to operations or forward thinking things like marketing, investing in assets, etc.
Can any TPOs be turned into an ownership situation if like after a certain point of the customer's like, I'd like to now own this outright? Like, what is that possible?
Absolutely, yeah, it's totally possible. You could do buyouts where you have to come up with a chunk of change to buy out the contract. So yes, and actually that's a really important question because homeowners, for instance, they're trying to sell their house. Some TPO providers might have different strategies there too. So maybe include what I'm saying right now in that previous question to ask your TPO provider is, hey, how are you going to treat a homeowner who's trying to sell their house? Can I buy it out and sell it easily to the next homeowner? Do you guys underwrite the new homeowner and just seamlessly transition to them? What does that look like for you? Because yeah, some of those are baked into contracts, some of them aren't, but you definitely want to know ahead of time.
I mean, the terms initially for the homeowner seem pretty great, but as the long-term aspect of this really starts to become longer term, right? Like, I don't know, a lot of things happen over 20 years. For everybody, the installer, the homeowner. Okay, so then I'm offering TPO, I'm offering leases now to my customers. How does a lease deal change my O&M strategy?
Again, question to ask, right? The provider, are these things factored in, and how are they factored in? What is the compensation if X happens, right? If I have to go replace a module, am I getting a $250 stipend? Am I getting 500? Like, what does that look like, right? So it is absolutely baked in. It's just you need to ask the details so you know from the O&M side, how much should I buffer more perhaps and think about these things. Like when you have, going back to the conversation about the flexibility of a provider being able to give you some of those savings on the tax credit and for yourself or for the homeowner, maybe that also changes how much you keep for yourself just to factor in future costs, right? So it's just, what is the TPO provider going to give you? How much does it really cost you to do said truck roll? Are you getting enough out of that deal? And that could tell you then and there, maybe that's not the provider for me. Or, oh, this is great. Well, yeah, let's go with it. And we can pass all the savings on to the homeowner, not worry about it on the back end.
Knowing that kind of a big part of the market also is following back up with a customer later to add a battery, and like we're kind of like not just servicing that system and praying nothing breaks and that's it. How does that get folded into a TPO as a kind of a upsell? Do I still have that option? Like what happens then?
Wow. That is a really powerful question that I don't know if I fully have an answer to, because I don't know that myself. But if we think about it for a second, I feel like you're going to be a little bit more restrictive in doing system additions, whether it be adding more PV or storage to a TPO product. Anytime you interconnect with an existing system, an old system, you're going to run into, possibly you're messing with something you shouldn't mess with, and it's working just fine as is. That said, though, a lot of times when you go in to add PV, and this is maybe from my experience here in Colorado, those are going to be two different systems, right? So it's going to be a second interconnection. It's going to be a second system, possibly with different, inverter, communication equipment, et cetera.
Mhm.
So in that case, it might be okay because it physically doesn't touch the existing system. So keep that in mind as you think about that as an installer is what is my local AHJ requiring me to do? What does my local utility require us to do? Can we tie into existing systems? Because like, for instance, let me use Colorado as my example. 10 years ago or so, we used to have a feed-in tariff where homeowners got paid like, I don't know, 4 cents a kilowatt hour for system production. When we would go to interconnect with those systems, do system additions, we couldn't touch it because doing so would start a new interconnection application and agreement, and the homeowner would get they would lose their grandfathered status because now they'd be getting just traditional net metering, which is dollar for dollar. So be mindful of what that would look like, I guess, just generally. That's not just TPOs, that's just generally.
Yeah.
But TPOs obviously might not have a beef with that either because you're not touching the existing system. Battery, though, if you're adding a battery, you're probably going to want to touch the existing system so you could charge it with PV. The power goes out and you have over a day's worth of outage. So check with your TPO provider. That's another question I'd ask. If that's a significant part of your market and who you address, add that as your list of questions to ask your TPO provider how that works.
This is great info for our audience. Let's end though with an example or two to maybe illustrate some of these points. Maybe how the wrong financing strategy either sunk or saved a business.
I look at it in terms of the installer who really went into the conversation with their lending providers with a clear set of intentions on what they want to ask and what they want their takeaways to be before, going through the process of onboarding, right? Because as much as a lot of installers go into those conversations going, oh, please allow me to get on your platform, pick me, I think you kind of need to flip the script a little bit and double check that that's the right fit for you and your customers in the first place. So right mindset, right strategy for the right installer is to do just that because you're asking them about all the things I mentioned earlier and interviewing them for your customers ultimately, right? So that's what saved a lot of companies is maybe avoiding the pitfalls of what could be a bad strategy for their customer base. And I'm not saying there's a right lender, raw lender. Please don't get that as your takeaway today. Please understand that not every lender might fit your specific market depending on who your customers are. I come from two very different installer backgrounds. One was low price, trying to subcontract, trying to be cheap, didn't do a fantastic job, and there's probably a reason they're not in business anymore. The other one I worked for, local lads who founded the company just with the intention of installing quality equipment and focusing on higher end clientele for new builds, et cetera. So and those are both serving where I live in Colorado, right? So it depends on your customer base, and the lender could be good for lender A or lender B. It just depends on you. So know who your customers are. If any important question you need to answer out of this is who are my customers and what do they need from a financier? If you need to ask that question, go ask it. Like literally, go right now. Go ask your customers that have financed, like, did this work out for you? What were you looking for? Did this work out, etc. So that's the right way to do it. Wrong way to do it is to not do any of those things and also not have a diversified strategy, not have a TPO provider, not have a loan provider. You need to have a mix of all. In fact, recently, this might be a nice plug for Energy Sage. They do a really good job of calling out data from over like the half of the year, and they showed something that pointed out that installers now have fewer finance providers than they did a year or two ago, which I think is important, right? Like you don't want to have a bevy of providers and confuse your sales team, confuse your operations team because they don't know which button to click in which portal, et cetera. But it's also, you don't want to be too constricting. You don't want to have just one or two. Two's maybe good. It depends. But you want to make sure you have a diverse portfolio of someone who does loan, someone who's TPO, maybe both. And then you also have others that fit in that wheelhouse with also making sure they stay happy. Because a lender is, I keep calling them lenders, they're fintechs, right? It depends on who it is. They might not want to be a second look business. They might want a certain amount of volume. So you got to keep them happy too. It's a relationship. Just like I'm going back to the first thing I mentioned with the interviewing you, you're also interviewing them to see if you guys are going to go well together. And if they're going to, be around for a while and you're going to be around for a while on their platform, because you'll be ideally doing a lot of business together and you want the whole ecosystem of your offering to be happy. Long-winded answer to your question, but that's really important. And if you need that sort of support, please hit me up at BayWa. Happy to help have those conversations with you to lean into those conversations you're going to be having with your finance providers.
I think that was a perfectly winded answer to that question. So
I'm out of breath.
Don't worry about that. But this was a great in-depth discussion on this topic, and it's going to continue to be relevant in the market going forward. And it's just an important conversation to have. Obviously, to keep the conversation going for anyone out there, seek out Josh, seek out BayWa RE. They're really the experts on this. But thanks for taking the time to share some of that brain with us today on Power Forward, Josh.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Been having fun today. Appreciate it.